Okay, thank you so much. My name is Ellie Cohen, CEO of the Climate Center based in California, and I'm with California State Assemblymember Cristina Garcia. We are speaking today about California's new natural carbon sequestration law and what it means for equity and climate. Next slide, please. So the current climate goals that we have globally, basically the prescription for what we need to do is based on the 1.5C report that came out 4 years ago, that in essence, we have to cut emissions in half by 2030, and we have to start the removal of up to 1,000 gigatons of past climate pollution from the atmosphere to get to a safe climate. And as we all know, the current pledges are not enough. It cuts greenhouse gases less than 1% per year between now and 2030. Next slide. So what is it we need to do on that carbon removal part? In the Western United States and California specifically, we're in the middle of a mega drought, which means a multi-decadal drought that has been made very severe because of climate change. And it threatens a Dust Bowl-like condition and many of the survivability of the crops that we grow in California that provide more than half of the vegetables and nuts and fruits for the country by 2027. Next slide. And with increasing climate impacts, we're seeing increasing health impacts, especially to our most vulnerable communities, especially heat waves, and even things like what's called valley fever, because as the soil dries out and the dust blows, it spreads valley fever. Next slide. California is the world's 5th largest economy and a global climate leader. Next slide. But California is behind. We have to accelerate our state policies for equitable greenhouse gas reductions and carbon removal, and we're not on track for 2030. Next slide. So I want to be clear when we talk about that part of the equation, that carbon removal, that we're talking about natural carbon sequestration and scaling it up as rapidly as possible on working lands, agricultural lands, natural lands, and urban lands. What it is not is carbon capture and storage, which is at the smokestack, which prevents some carbon dioxide from going into the atmosphere. Direct air capture is a new form of technological carbon removal that is just being tested around the world and only now sequesters a tiny part of emissions. So what do we have available to us today? Natural carbon removal or nature-based sequestration. Next slide. So our goal here is to scale up natural carbon removal. At the Climate Center, we did an analysis in partnership with the Carbon Cycle Institute and found that in California alone, if we manage our soils and our habitats and wetlands in a much better way, we can sequester upwards of 100 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year, or 1/4 of the current state emissions. How do we do that? By building healthy soils, including applying compost, with carbon farming and gardening, with climate-smart habitat restoration and management, enhancing protected habitats, and engaging indigenous communities and using traditional ecological knowledge. Next slide. There are many benefits to this approach because when you sequester carbon, you have healthier soils and healthier habitats, and that means more water and food security. That means that we are becoming more resilient to drought, extreme heat, and wildfire. It means cleaner air and water, especially for frontline and urban communities. It means that we have more resilience for our food crops. It supports biodiversity and creates new jobs. Next slide. So we were very excited to work with Assemblymember Garcia to draft and actually have passed in the California State Legislature this year a natural carbon sequestration bill that Ms. Garcia was the lead author of. We had 80 organizations across California supporting it, including some small farmers and ranchers, local governments, and many non-governmental organizations and environmental justice leaders. The gist of the law is that it requires the state to set ambitious goals for natural carbon sequestration for 2030, 2038, and 2045. Now the hard work begins to get the goals set by January of 2025. Next slide. So I'm pleased to hand the mic to Assemblymember Cristina Garcia, who represents Southeast Los Angeles.
Thank you, Ellie, for that. Like Ellie said, I represent the 58th Assembly District. When you think of California, you think of Disneyland, you think of our coastlines, you think of our sierras and our beautiful forests. You dream of visiting Yosemite Park maybe one day and hiking the sierras out there, visiting El Capitan. And those are all amazing things that make California great. And that's part of that's part of what we're trying to capitalize on when we did this bill out there and the resources that is there. But let me paint for you another picture, because this COP is about the haves and the have-nots, the individuals that have contributed the most to climate change and the individuals who are having the biggest burden. And California has those two realities as well. And I live in that other reality where we're shouldering the burden for climate change and the impacts. I live in a community that's one of the densest in the United States, not just in California. A community that's zigzagged by freeways. Our rivers have been paved over and they're concrete jungles, like we like to say. And so we have an extreme heat island that's also overburdened with pollution at the same time. And so for me, it's not just about maximizing or fighting climate change at the global level. We're bringing it back home. And how do I ensure my community is healthier? Because there's an extreme heat wave. It's my community who is ending up in the hospital. It's my community who's dying. When there is an extreme heat wave, it's my community that's taking those pollutants that are becoming an even more toxic stew that's making them sick and giving them asthma and cancer and other respiratory diseases. There's a lot of coincidence that the same community saw a disproportional rate of hospitalizations and deaths during the pandemic as well. And so as we did this bill, I'm proud that we are able to maximize what makes California great, our forests and our oceans. 90% of California's land is ideal for carbon capture. So when we talk about these goals, it might seem lofty to some individuals, but I think they're very realistic and very doable for our state here in California. I'm glad that we get to be a leader and that we're doing it in a way that is financially responsible and in a way that is not saying that we're going to continue to pollute in other communities. We're going to actually make communities cleaner. And I want to make this clear. This is in addition to the emission reductions that we must do and not in a replacement of, which is something that we worked hard for this bill. This bill is a great first step, but it has limitations. When we started this, we saw ourselves setting some real goals and not asking an advisory group to do it later or not asking a bureaucratic agency to do it later. The reality is that I live in a place where I have to convince enough of my peers to vote for this out there and different competing interests. And so at the end of the day, we've entrusted the Air District and the food and agricultural agencies to come together. But we are ensuring that at the table, we have environmental justice group members and that we have our Native American members as well. While traditionally we have placed stock on our academics, our researchers, our institutions, those are important. But we can't forget the folks who have been managing the lands long before we were here or who are bearing those burdens on a regular basis as well. And so while we did not get our initial policy, which was to sequester at least 60 million metric tons of carbon dioxide by 2030, 75 million metric tons of carbon dioxide by 2035, I am happy that we're going to ensure that this is a guaranteed part of the equation moving forward, which hasn't been the case in California thus far. And so while we have been a leader, we have plenty of blind spots, and this begins to correct that blind spot for myself. And so I will say when I started the journey on this bill, a lot of people asked me why I was doing this bill. I've been working in natural resources and climate change for the 10 years I've been in the legislature, but I haven't worked in this space because I don't have the forest, I don't have the oceans in my district. But ultimately, maximizing that is going to allow my community to be healthier in the long run and ensure that we have the clean air that we need, that we have the water quality that we need to be able to have a healthier community out there. And so it's been an exciting adventure to be part of this discussion along the way.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember Garcia. Before we open it up for questions to everyone, I wanted to ask you some questions. What do you think are the challenges now in implementing this law?
Yes. This is not my first advisory board where I bring the community to the table. It's an important tool. But how do I ensure that those community members have the toolkit to be able to make sure they have an equal footing at that table with all the other advocates at the same time and that their voices are not going to be lost in the process? We also have a agency that is appointed by elected officials, and they have those political pressures as well. And we just had an election last night, and we are still figuring out what those votes are. And so the reality is that they do not work in a vacuum, and they are going to get pulled in different directions that are going to be telling them that we should concentrate further on technologies, that we should be using carbon capture instead of this, that this is somehow better, even though it costs more, even though it's not a natural solution. And even though that those solutions keep telling communities like mine that we are disposable, that we continue to be a wasteland, that our health doesn't matter in the long haul as well. And so making sure we have the political will, which is the thing that we have going on here at COP once again, to actually ensure that we set goals that are ambitious, that are doable, and are actually going to get implemented. And that we balance those challenges out there, especially with our agricultural communities as well, as we need them to be partners with us.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. How do we ensure that equity is really baked into the implementation of this bill and others? And what are some of the things that California is doing? As you said, this COP is focused on the global north versus the global south in many ways. And I think there may be some lessons for what we're learning in California that might be helpful to some of our friends and colleagues around the world.
First and foremost, we need to have the political will to say no to our wealthy friends out there who have been contributing the most to climate change, is the reality. And so whether that's in California or that's in our African countries, out there, we need to have the will to say no and put these disadvantaged communities, these vulnerable communities at the forefront, which means that we do need to start investing real dollars there in those communities, both to ensure that they are resilient, but that they're also healthier in the immediate as well. And so that takes a lot of time. In California, we have a cap and trade program that comes with a lot of criticisms out there as well, and we should be doing it better. But we are taking a big pot of that money and putting it directly into our hotspot communities, our communities that are the most polluted, our communities that are most vulnerable, and we're tasking them with the challenge of creating a plan to clean up their air and reduce their emissions out there. That's been a challenge because it's a compromise with all the stakeholders at the table, and it's far from perfect. But they have a real voice. And so for the first time in 30 years, refineries are having to retrofit in California. For the first time in 30 years, we're starting to monitor pesticides and the effect that has on our air out there and our quality as well. And so you're seeing gains. Are the gains fast enough? Definitely not. Are the gains equitable? If we're only doing it in one community and not all of our vulnerable communities, that's not real equity either. And so we, I think, have plenty to say we've been doing well, but we have plenty to say how to do it better with our counterparts out there. But the first step is ensuring that those voices are at the table. It's hard to ignore. It's hard to ignore the urgency of individuals sharing with you the plight of their neighbors. I think it's been hard for my colleagues to ignore the urgency when I come and talk to them about my neighbors who are sick and who are in and out of the hospital, or who are stressed out about taking their child to the hospital or going to work when their child has an asthma attack out there. And so those stories are invaluable in moving us to do the right thing. And so I would say that that's one of the most important pieces that we've been able to do in California.
Thank you so much. One more question for you from me, which is that, as you mentioned, yesterday were the elections in the United States and in California, and you are chair of the California Assembly Women's Caucus. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what that means to you and what are some of the successes you've had and what's the latest news on that?
Yeah, definitely. I'm the chair of the California Legislative Women's Caucus. We're bicameral, we're bipartisan, we are far from equity. But when we started this work 8 years ago, we were down to just 23 women. We are 39 now. But after last night's election, we will be about 50, 60 is parity. And so some great advancements along the way. We had stall in California after Jerry Brown left on climate change policies, but this year has been historic in California, not just with this bill, but with the whole package of bills out there. All but one of those bills was authored and championed by women in the legislature out there as well. And so when women are at the table, we have anecdotal data this year alone that we are going to get things done, and we're going to move our communities forward in an equitable way out there. And so for me, it's exciting to be able to bring voices that are not just gender diverse, but also ethnic diverse, that look more like California out there, to be able to tackle these problems and have the political will to get it done. Most of these women were tested with millions of dollars against them. But that means that they get to come in with a little more freedom to have the political will to say no to their friends when they need to get some strong policy done.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'll take questions from all of you. Some questions?
Hello. Hi, my name is Prachi. I'm a graduate student from Emory University. And actually, my current research in my master's is looking at air pollution from warehousing in the Inland Empire in Southern California. And so my question for you is, because it's such a huge environmental justice issue, how is the government in Southern California addressing large corporations like Amazon that have a huge boom in warehousing and commerce and distribution?
Thank you. Yeah, something that myself and my colleagues are very worried about. So to paint the picture for you, we talked about the port of Long Beach and the port of LA recently, and how we had too many goods coming in, and we changed the way we shopped suddenly. And so they were creating a pollution cluster at the port. But the reality is that pollution cluster doesn't stop there. It continues there to the rail yard in my district, and then it continues from the rail on, or it continues through my district onto the Inland Empire, into those warehouses that have become magnets out there. And so in California, these same community groups that have been fighting for about 20 years for indirect source rules, that are part of the community action groups we've created along the way, were able to finally get an indirect source rule passed out there. First step. The second step is making sure it's implemented. And so our Attorney General has recently been suing to stop a number of these developments out there. We are looking to strengthen CEQA. I had a bill, unfortunately, that died in the legislature this year, but it said that you would have to do CEQA mitigations in those communities, no more offsets, which is something that's allowed right now. And so it's not about making someone else healthier, but how do I make these communities healthier and not tell them that they have to keep waiting as well. And so the progress continues. I do want to give a shout out to our Attorney General, has been aggressive on these lawsuits out there to stop that. And it's a community activist out there. And I can't tell you how many times I have had to call a community activist and say, hey, have you heard what the council member's planning for this vacant lot? Please show up to the council meeting out there and say something to stop that. We don't need more trucks in my community. We don't need another Amazon distribution center out there as well. And so I will say that as much as the government is doing, how do we fund these local community groups so that they could do that work and they could be that voice, and not expect them to just be doing it for free? We pay people for lots of things. And so how do we compensate them adequately for their time in addition to the training that they need as well? And so that's one of the things that we are looking at, is how do we support that through different NGOs. We put what I think is pennies to the dollar in California towards giving some of those NGOs money. We have about $20 million. It's less than a penny when you look at our $300 billion budget this year. And so I'm not delusional, but it's a step. And so I hope that it's the seeds that will hopefully flower into something much bigger along the way.
Other questions? Okay, thank you very much. And I want to acknowledge again Assemblymember Cristina Garcia, who's been a real champion on climate change, on justice, and so much more. 10 years in the state legislature. Thank you so very much.
Do we have time left over? I'm going to talk about my other favorite
Would you
project.
like to say something more?
Yeah.
Please.
So
you have time. How much time do you have left? Yeah.
I want to talk about equity just a little bit further with this, which is what a lot of discussion here has been in COP, not just this year, but in previous years. This is not my first COP out there. And there's a lot of discussion about financial support for our developing countries out there. It's not any different than the discussion that we have in California about financial support to help communities like mine adapt along the way. And, you know, there's a lot of discussions of how do we control it versus how do we work with the community members on the ground to help dictate how best to help them move that progress forward. And if we're going to be doing equity, we need to create an agenda that's not just us telling individuals or countries, this is what you need, but how do we create an agenda that helps meet everyone's goals at the end of the day out there as well? And so as I've been listening to different groups talking with each other and talking over each other for the last few years on these issues, you know, I hope that we start to listen to what we need. And I would say in the 10 years that I've been in the legislature, part of what I've been able to see with groups like the Climate Center or NRDC or EDF, these more established environmental groups, is that they have stopped telling community groups that are smaller in communities like mine what they need, but instead asking them, what do you need? And how do we help each other with our agenda? And it's been through that we've been able to pass a little bit more in the equity space in California as well. And so I hope that we are going to step out of our uncomfortableness, and we're going to have a little bit of humility when we walk into these rooms and we ask folks, what do you need and how do we do that together? But on the other side, I hope we also say, well, these are my needs, and we're willing to find a compromise along the way as well. And so I think we can't afford to keep talking over each other. The consequences are dire for vulnerable communities, but they're dire for our economies as well. And California runs the risk of losing billions of dollars, whether it's on agriculture or infrastructure out there. And so whether it's you're on the higher end of the spectrum or the lower end of the spectrum, this is the moment that we are all in crisis and need to come together.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.